Mark 12:13-17. Should we pay taxes? Some years ago, there was a national radio program during which listeners would call in to get solutions to their car problems. The program hosts were good at figuring out most of the problems, but were occasionally wrong. So, to test their diagnostic capabilities, they included something called Stump the Chumps, where they would call back some of the callers to see if they had given the right answer to that caller's problem. This was always an interesting part of the program. If you were to read ahead in Mark 12, you would see some people trying to stump Jesus with difficult questions. In Mark 12:13-17, the Pharisees and Herodians ask whether they should pay taxes to Caesar. In Mark 12:18-27, the Sadducees question whether there will ever be a resurrection. In Mark 12:28-34, a scribe asks which of God's commands was the most important. Jesus answers each of the questions, but often does it in a way that is not expected. As we look at these questions, notice how Jesus responds and the masterful way he answers them. Let's read Mark 12:13-17. Then they sent to him some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to catch him in his words. When they had come, they said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are true and care about no one, for you do not regard the person of men, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Shall we pay or shall we not pay?" But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, "Why do you test me? Bring me a denarius that I may see it." So they brought it. And he said to them, "Whose image and inscription is this?" They said to him, "Caesar's." And Jesus answered and said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they marveled at him. What does it say? The Jewish leaders sent some Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus to trick him into saying something wrong. When they arrived, they told him that they knew he was true, that he didn't care about anyone, that he did not regard who people were, but that he taught God's ways faithfully. They then asked if it was lawful to pay taxes to Caesar. Should they pay or not pay? Jesus recognized their hypocrisy, but still replied to them. He asked why they were testing him, and then told them to bring him a denarius coin to look at it. They did this, and he asked them whose image and inscription were on it. They said that it was Caesar's. Jesus then told them to give back to Caesar the things that were his, and to give to God the things that were his. So what does it mean? First of all, this passage tells us something about the Jewish leaders. As you look at verses 13-15, you quickly notice some things about the Jewish leaders who questioned Jesus. Who they were and why they came help us to understand the meaning of this part of the chapter. Verse 13 says, "Then they sent to him some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to catch him in his words." So first we see the Jewish leaders saw Jesus as an enemy. Until recently, Jesus had been just a rogue rabbi from the north. But ever since his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, he had become a clear and present danger to the Jewish leaders. In Mark 11:15-20, Jesus had cast the merchandise sellers out of the temple courtyard. In Mark 11:27-33, Jesus had refused to tell the religious leaders by what authority he had cleansed the temple. Then in Mark 12:1-12, Jesus had likened the religious leaders to unfaithful workers who deserved to be destroyed by God. They had attempted to arrest him at that point, but were unable to because of the crowds around him. They were now looking for another way to destroy him, this time with trickery. If they could catch him saying something that was against the Bible or against the current government, they could get him into trouble and have grounds for removing him. So they sent a delegation of Pharisees and Herodians to ask him a tricky question. The mixture of Pharisees and Herodians together was a bit odd because these groups had vastly different ideas about Roman rule. One commentator says this: "The Pharisees, known for their intense nationalism, keenly objected to all foreign domination and opposed the paying of tribute to the Romans as signifying such subjection. Since the Herodian dynasty was dependent upon and cultivated favor of Rome, The Herodians would favor the payment of the tax as advantageous. But Jesus' opposition to the current regime meant that these two groups were willing to join together to defeat him. I find that interesting. Now look at verse 14. When they had come, they said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are true and care about no one, for you do not regard the person of men, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Did you notice how these people addressed Jesus? They referred to him as a teacher with good motives, good character, and that was actually true. He was a teacher who taught the truth, who didn't care what others thought, and who didn't change his speech depending on who was with him. He was different than most of the religious leaders. I would imagine that most people kowtowed to the religious leaders in Jerusalem. They had great power to put down anyone who did not submit to their authority. Remember what they did to the early Christians in Acts 4 through 7? However, they saw in Jesus someone who was independent of their influence and authority. But what they said was mere flattery, meant to soften him up before the attack. Now look at the end of verse 14, the beginning of 15. They ask the question, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Shall we pay or shall we not pay?" Here we see the Jewish leaders were not happy with Roman rule. The question as to whether they should pay the annual Roman census tax was something that bothered many of the Jewish people. Remember that they had been defeated and put under the power of the Roman government. When they asked about paying taxes to Caesar, they were referring to the annual poll tax. It's something that the Roman emperor had started in the year 86, when Judea had become a Roman province. We learn about that from Josephus in his book, The Antiquities of the Jews. The money went directly to the emperor, and the tax wasn't very popular because it reminded them that they were subjects of Rome. Now, what did these two groups think about the tax? Remember, there were two groups that came, the Pharisees and the Herodians. The Pharisees, who were religious Jews, leaned more toward not paying the tax. The Jewish people were supposed to be governed only by God, but they had been subjugated by the Roman Empire. Was paying taxes to the Romans something that God condoned in the Bible? On the other hand, the Herodians were political Jews who supported King Herod, who had been put in place by the Roman government. They had no problem with paying the tax as it supported their political leader. Now, how did these two groups get together? Once again, we must remember that these men were sent by the religious leaders for a purpose. When they asked whether they should pay the census tax, they were trying to put Jesus in a difficult spot. If he had answered them that they were to pay tribute to Caesar, then that would have meant that he put Caesar ahead of Moses and the law. And if he said they were not to pay tribute, he would have been guilty of insurrection against Caesar. With only two possible answers, which would Jesus choose? Now, a second thing, this passage tells us something about Jesus. First off, Jesus knew their intentions. Look at verses 15 to 16. It says, "But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, 'Why do you test me? Bring me a denarius that I may see it.' So they brought it, and he said to them, 'Whose image and inscription is this?' They said to him, 'Caesar's.'" We'll stop there. As the Son of God, Jesus was able to see into the hearts of men. He immediately detected that they were hypocrites, that they had malicious intent, even though they used a lot of flattery. This is why Jesus asked them why they were testing him. It wasn't that he did not know. Instead, he was declaring that he knew what they were doing. But instead of playing along with their trickery, he used the opportunity to teach them how to respond to government and to God. He asked them to bring him a denarius. Now, I'd like to read something about the denarius. It says, "The common Roman denarius, a small silver coin, was the only coin acceptable for imperial tax payments." According to one of Jesus' parables, the denarius was worth a day's wage. You see that in Matthew 20, verses 1 through 16. As they looked at the coin, He asked them whose image was on the coin. They answered that it was Caesar's image. Now, what did the coin look like? I've seen pictures of this on the internet. One commentator said that there was a portrait of Tiberius Caesar, who reigned from AD 14 to 37. And the inscription in Latin read, Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of the divine Augustus. And on the other side it said, chief priests. The inscription originated in the imperial cult of emperor worship and was a claim to divinity which was particularly repulsive to Jews. This description reveals that the Jewish people would have been upset not only with being under Roman rule and having to pay taxes, but also would have been opposed to Caesar claiming to be divine or the son of a divine person. What then would Jesus say about paying taxes to such a person? As his questioners looked at this Roman coin, Jesus gave them an answer that they would never forget. Look at verse 17. It says, And Jesus answered and said to them, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So, our next thought is this. Jesus recognized our duty toward government. Jesus recognized our duty toward government. In a surprise move, Jesus told his questioners to render or to give back to Caesar the things that are his. The coin had been made by Caesar's government, and it had his image on it, and it represented all that the Roman government did for those under its rule. Jesus was showing the people that Caesar should be paid taxes because he and his government were the ones who ruled over them at that time. Hendrickson notes that honoring God does not mean dishonoring the emperor by refusing to pay for the privileges. A relatively orderly society, police protection, good roads, courts, etc., that one enjoys. At this particular time, the Roman Empire had brought peace and tranquility to the people under its sway, and this, to a degree, seldom, if ever, experienced either before or afterward. Such a blessing implies a responsibility. By answering this way, Jesus could not be accused of rebelling against the Roman government, but that was not his point. He was showing that government has its place even when the government is not of your own choosing. The New Testament continues the same thought, stating that believers should obey government because it is ordained by God, and that obedience is required unless doing so would conflict with obedience to God. I'd like to give you a number of references to look up on your own. Daniel 3, 16 through 18, Daniel 6, 8 to 10, Acts 5, 29, Romans 13, 1 to 7, 1 Timothy 2, 1 to 6, and 1 Peter 2, 13 to 17. Well, we don't have time to go through those now. You might go back and look those up at a later time. So another thought about this is that Jesus recognized our duty toward God. We just looked at our duty towards government. Now Jesus recognized our duty toward God. Again, looking at verse 17, he said, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Notice that Jesus' answer did not end with what to do about paying the tax. He told them to give back to Caesar what was his and to give back to God what was his. As mentioned earlier, they were to pay taxes to Caesar. But this obedience to government should never replace a believer's allegiance to God. Caesar may have claimed a deity on that coin, but they were not to worship him as such. Taxes, yes. Worship, no. God deserves our complete allegiance, and our lives should be devoted to him always. To sum things up, Jesus was addressing both the Pharisees and the Herodians with his answer. I'm going to quote someone here. In short, he bids the proud Pharisee not to refuse his dues to Caesar, and the worldly Herodian not to refuse his dues to God. Interesting. The Pharisees didn't want to pay taxes. He told them to do it. The Herodians were very much involved with politics, but they needed to remember to give to God what he deserved. After hearing Jesus answer, the people were amazed at what he said. He had not only escaped their trap, but had also given them something to think about. Speaking of which, we come to our third question. How does it apply? First of all, consider your words carefully. The religious leaders who tried to trick Jesus were the same ones that fought against the early Christians. As Jesus said at another time, "If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you." That's from John 15, 18, and 20. There will come a time when someone will try to trip you up with a trick question. They enjoy seeing a Christian painted into a corner and unable to answer. They want you to fail. In times like that, take time to respond. Don't blurt out the first thing you think. Ask the Lord to give you wisdom and the discernment when to speak and whether to speak at all. But when you do speak, speak the truth as revealed in the Bible. This is what God will use to awaken the spiritually dead. Another thought, consider your duty to government. The government of the United States is much different than that which the Jews lived under. Here we have a constitutional republic which guarantees us the opportunity to voice our opinions and to vote for leaders who share our beliefs. But there are times when our government does things we dislike. When this happens, it would be good to consider what God says about our duty to government. We must submit to government rules, 1 Peter 2:13. We should pray for those in government roles, 1 Timothy 2, 1-2. And we should remember that government is designed by God to hold back evil, Romans 13, verses 3-6. The last thought, consider your duty to God. While politics can be very interesting, especially during election season, we need to keep our focus on what is most important. Our main focus should be God. After all, He has done for each of us. We should consider giving Him our lives in daily worship and service. Consider what Romans 12, 1-2 says to believers. "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." Let me ask you a question. Are you giving to God what He deserves today? If not, you need to repent of this wrong focus and give to God what He deserves, your life, your love, and your service. Now our conclusion. In these verses, we have seen how the enemies of Jesus tried to trick Him into making a statement that would get Him in trouble with the government or make Him look like He opposed what the Bible taught. But Jesus knew what they were doing, and His answer wonderfully addressed the needs of the Pharisees, Herodians, and the people who were listening. While we can marvel at Jesus' wise response, this would not be the end of questions posed to Him. Stay tuned.